Clayman Media.
You're listening to the We Bear Witness podcast, where we discuss theological truths and cultural influences. Our podcasts are available via Google, Spotify, Apple, YouTube, and many other podcast platforms. We hope you subscribe and enjoy the show.
Hey everyone, thank you for listening. We greatly appreciate it. Hope everyone's had a wonderful week. Happy Monday to you. Today I have Pastor Forrest on. We are talking about multi-site churches and sort of correlating that with the plans that churches put into place for church planning as they hope to increase the kingdom, increase their members. The difference between that, a network of churches. We see a lot of stuff in evangelicalism these days. And I think we're just going to try to take a quick look at it this episode and see, not spend time complaining about the ones we don't like or fighting for the only philosophy we think works inside a church. That's not necessarily the goal. And I think it definitely can borderline on elitist to think there's someone that just has a perfect church and knows exactly what to do. And we're certainly not saying that no good can happen from a multi-site church setup. We have plenty of gospel-loving friends in multi-site churches and leaders and members of those churches. But what our goal is as Christians and should be is to work continually to reform our churches in light of Scripture. And so there will be a little pushback, I'm sure, but we'd love to hear from you. And everyone's allowed opinions, but this is in no way chastising movement, growth, the ability for people to expand and share the gospel. I think all of that needs to be celebrated. It's a big aim of ours, as well as we are pastors of Amelia Baptist Church in Amelia Island, Florida, expanding ourselves and growing in number and having these conversations all the time. But you said, Forrest, you had read an article from J.D. Greear, who many of you don't know. He's the pastor of Summit Church in North Carolina. He's sort of in the Durham area, what they call the Summits. They're in the middle of three major colleges, and they've grown like crazy. He's planted more churches than anyone in the SBC, I think. So he does church plants, but he also is multi-site. So they have several sites or campuses. And the idea of a multi-site is there's a group of people in another location that are still considered part of that main church, but they meet somewhere else in a different building, and they have live worship, they have fellowship, they even perpetuate small groups and fellowship activities outside of church events. But the preaching isn't live. The preaching, if live, it's streamed in. Usually it's not live, or it's pre-recorded and then that is shown. So it really depends on different setups. But there's not really, the difference between multi-site is that the people there, the pastors, the campus pastors, what they're often called, or site pastors, are not the preaching pastors, and they function as an extension of that main body, almost like they're set up kind of in another room on campus. And that's been pretty common. I think you have to throw a rock pretty far to not see a church that's doing that in your area, wherever you're listening to this podcast, unless you're somewhere all over the globe, which you might be. That might not be happening where you are, but it's certainly happening in certain parts of the United States. So, Forrest, in your words, what points is Greear making? And then even seeing the pros that he gives for multi-site church setup and how one would even get to that place. What do you think about it?
Yeah, I think, like you said, I think the important thing is to realize we're talking about this idea of like streaming the preaching, that kind of model of multi-site. Looked at Greer's article primarily because we could find people that we in no way, shape, or form agree with. We could go out and find you somebody who's going to justify it and say it's because that way they can, pipe in the gold dust of the Holy Spirit and some kind of craziness that, Greer, while we may disagree on things like multi-site or something, there's a lot of what he does that is very good. And, he holds to a lot of the same theological positions we do. So I think it's important to, to look at that and say, don't just find a straw man and let's go attack that. He makes some very good points here. Again, his book, Stop Asking Jesus Into Your Heart, is an amazing work that I think many people reference. So I do have a lot of respect for him. He writes in this article, and it's interesting, this article was actually posted on 9 Marks. And 9 Marks, if you know anything about them, is very opposed to multi-site. They're opposed to multi-service in one church building, let alone multi-site. That's kind of against their philosophy. So if we were comparing ourselves to 9 Marks, our church currently would not fit the 9 Marks model. They would disagree with how we're doing things because we do have 2 services.
Right.
And so just to throw that caveat in at the beginning. But Greer, he makes some good points. He makes some interesting points about about why they did it in their church, how it works for them. He makes an interesting caveat. He says that they do believe that the church needs to be able to gather. That gathering is an important part of the church function. That the assembly. And so he actually talks about the fact that all of their their multi-sites, not church plants, their multi-sites are in the metro area that they're in. So, you might have the East Side campus, the West Side campus, whatever, and that periodically throughout the year, they do have gatherings that everyone gathers in one location. And so I thought that was an interesting fact. I didn't know that about them before reading the article. That's not everybody's technique. Some guys are saying, we're one church in 4 states and the online campus and all that stuff. I think we're probably is more middle of the road than those kind of positions. And so I respect that. But he actually makes the argument that multi-site is acceptable, if not better alternative to addressing a church's growth than wow, we cannot talk tonight. Then building bigger buildings or multiple services or even planting new churches. And the planting churches thing I thought was very interesting. When you read what he says, he basically says, if you plant a church, if you're in a situation where your church is growing rapidly and you send out a group to plant, that your growth will probably replace those people pretty quickly. And so you're not actually going to, by doing a multi-site, you can send hundreds of people over there because they're not truly leaving your church. And so they're much more willing to go than if it's planting, you're probably only going to get 50, 60 people willing to go.
And if that site doesn't work out, they can kind of yo-yo back.
Yeah, absolutely. And so he makes that argument. He really argues a lot about how it is a better use of resources than maybe a traditional just keep building approach.
Yeah.
And I thought that was an interesting take. We being in close proximity to Jacksonville and seeing kind of the struggles that First Baptist Jax has endured over the last few years of kind of figuring out what are they going to do with a sanctuary that seats way more than they are able to fill. It is an interesting situation. That being said, I feel like there are some things that I don't agree with. Just he makes some interesting points, but I think at the end of the day, I feel like there are other solutions other than just showing Pastor Adam's face on a big screen and a church, in a gym at a school 3 miles down the road. It is funny. It does remind me. I knew a guy that builds Dollar Generals, and we here on the coast don't have it as much. But if you get in the rural parts of Florida or Georgia, Dollar Generals are everywhere, right? And he said that their corporate philosophy was if they had a Dollar General that was producing really well, just couldn't keep things on the shelves, they would go 3 miles down the road and build another one. And if that one continued to do really well, they would go back the other direction, 3 miles the other direction, and build another one. And that was how they were building them. And all throughout the recession, he was busy building Dollar Generals for them. It's funny because I feel like in some ways the multi-site model borrows a lot from the Dollar General of evangelical Christianity. That may be the hot take that gets us in trouble, me calling them the Dollar General of evangelical Christianity. But I don't know. What do you think about his? What do you think about his idea of that it is healthier than building bigger buildings?
Well, I'm not for building a giant building and then building a bigger building after that I think that can speak to the testament of man. I think you can get into some Babel territory there. And honestly, I feel like effective pastoring needs to be part of living in light of the scripture when it comes to the offices over that church. I think there are a few problems to answer that question that would also be my general problems with the trend of multi-sites. And again, this is not saying that you're just against every one of them. You don't see the reason for every one of them. I think there are distinct variables to each of them. And I also have applauded even non-denominational churches in our own community who have started off multi-site, but their intent has always been to put a pastor there and be involved in a network of those churches. But the pastor there would eventually be preaching, and they're raising up preachers, and they're raising up people who can preach the gospel, like we saw Paul do and Barnabas do and Timothy do. So to me, that I think is one of the losses there. But the goal, I don't think, is just to make one giant building get bigger, get bigger, get bigger where you are. I think that has not. I haven't seen a lot of fruit come. I've seen more problems than fruit come from that. I guess when it comes to discipleship, you see, the goal with a bigger building is, to me, connected to if salvation's the only goal. If a profession of faith, a one-time profession of faith, is the only goal, then yeah, big, huge buildings getting as many people in with a giant front door and a just as big back door, go right ahead, and you have a revolving door kind of aspect, a revolving door kind of system. But if the goal of the church is discipleship, it makes more sense to key in the preaching, to have it more personal, and to keep it to a relative size that can be effectively pastored. And I'm saying this as someone who is a part of a church that hopefully wants to build a new building in 5 to 6 years. We have a small building right now. We're in 2 worship services because of it, and we know friends down the street who are running twice as many people as we're running, and they're in 3 worship services, and they hope to build a bigger building. So I think a lot of this has to do with pastoral staffing and size. So I think in some cases, building a bigger building is the right call. But when you have a certain amount, when you've reached a size where you still believe you don't have to sacrifice your convictions or the philosophy of ministry or effective pastoring, the goal and the answer there, like I agree with them, is not just to build a bigger building. That's not the goal of everywhere you're planted. The goal is to spread the gospel and bring the kingdom forward. And I think Dollar General's right on the money. I think just build a church like you 5 miles down the street, get it funded, get it self-sustained, build preachers, disciple preachers. It's a large part of what pastors should be doing, which, by the way, is why typically they don't have a good successor when it's their time to retire, and they have to hire some outside guy who ends up not having a good rapport with his people. And that's another risk to this whole thing that we'll get in a little bit. But yeah, I'm not big on just build a big building. I mean, I think we will, because our philosophy of ministry is not to build a big one. But if we're running 400 people, why not build something that holds 600 seats? And then when we have that, the very first day we walk into that new building, start talking about how we are going to church plant from pastors that we've raised and have been discipling over the next 5, 6 years. And so to me, I think there's like a cutoff point. I don't have a number in mind. I think that's really kind of silly to talk about an exact number because every church is different. But if you can effectively pastor and they're involved and there's real fellowship, salvation can't be the goal. Discipleship has to be the goal. And discipleship takes longer. It takes more intimacy. It takes more vulnerability. It takes relationships. And we're kind of kidding ourselves if we think that one of the key reasons why multi-site trends take off as well as they do is because people are kind of okay with looking at a screen when there's preaching rather than looking in the eyes of a person or feeling that that person might know what they went through that week. And so I think there's just some good questions to ask without dismaying the idea of kingdom expansion. We are wishing our friends and sister churches, in network, wonderful success if they're choosing to go this route. But the success is discipleship. The success is finishing well and running the race well, not just gathering a bunch of numbers and sending them back to the convention like you did anything. And so we got to be very careful of how we approach these topics. But yeah.
Yeah, you said something a minute ago that I thought I want to talk about the idea of kind of this, your context or kind of a personalization that you get in one location. I think when you look at multi-site, if you're honest, you realize that there has to be kind of a generic, you have to generic your church out, because even though you're saying, well, we're in one metro area, there are very different aspects. And if you've ever been in a big city, you know that there are certain neighborhoods that are nothing like other neighborhoods, and that's just a fact of life. And so to say, well, we're one church, we're multiple neighborhoods, the face on the screen cannot be speaking to the exact instant that's happening in that neighborhood. The same way that a pastor who lives in the area, works here, all the people are from around there, have that. And so, a lot of this kind of conversation that we started was because the other day I was listening to the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill podcast, which is old news. I've actually listened to it once before. It was just
Mike Cosper, Christianity Today, I think, put it out. And
and let me just go ahead and throw the disclaimer out there, mentioning that I'm not saying that the conclusions he draws are valid conclusions. I think it's an interesting autopsy of a church that died, and the
sea of churches.
Yeah. And so I think
Multi-site.
it is interesting to look at. I would say that there's much about that ended up being throwing the baby out with the bathwater, and some kind of missed landings where things went wrong. But
Yeah.
one of the things they talked about was the idea that there was pressure on the campus pastors to make sure that their campuses fit the franchise. It's like this, everything should be the same. It's similar to, the Chick-fil-A model, right? If you go to Chick-fil-A, you're going to get the same thing at every place because they very rigidly control each franchise, and that's what you love about them because it's a consistent experience. The problem is if you take a church and do the same thing, yeah, you may end up with high quality in that
Yeah.
everybody's going to say my pleasure at the door. However, you're not going to have that personalized experience where, and I know that was one of the things that was explored in the podcast. And I think if you're honest with a multi-site scenario, that's always going to be the case. How if you are the central church and you're trying to make sure that everything, like I think even in this article, Greer mentions the idea that they make sure that every site fits their church DNA, which is important. It's important to know who you are and make sure you're in line with that. However, that could be that you're telling one site, hey, you need to act like these other people. You don't need to act that way. You need to be in line with what we have determined, our church does. And so I think that would be a flaw of the system. I think there is a lot of value in being able to shepherd your people in a very intimate way that comes from knowing them, knowing their lives, being connected to them. And I think the same argument would be made for a single site location of 20,000 people. You're not going to be able to have the shepherding in that kind of environment, I don't think.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And I think in the same way a guy with 20 people in his church can make it all about him. You find, I think that's one of the main arguments against multi-site, and I would agree with some of those issues to say that a lot more is placed on the leadership. A lot more is at risk. It's not just that, oh, well, this man is talented at speaking, so let's move that out. I know of multi-sites that are happening even right now where the campus pastor is a great preacher. There's absolutely no reason why he wouldn't be able to keep that growth going. So there is a push, trendy wise, to this where the guy preaching should be able to unite all these campuses. But even down to the word multi-site church, it's a misnomer. So, and what I mean by that is if a church is constituted by the preaching of the word, and Lehman says this, and the distribution of the ordinances under the binding authority of the keys, every campus where those activities transpire is actually a church. So it's not a site, it's a church. And so multi-site church is really just a collection of churches. They're just under one administration. So why are they under one administration? And what are some of the things culturally that work against that? Well, in this case, if you look at campuses, I'm not saying they can't have good leadership in the sense that the campus pastors don't do great jobs of getting in touch with everyone or even good fellowship. And I even bet their small groups strong. But in the case of multi-site churches, what effectively unites the churches of a multi-site church are the budget, the pastor's charisma, and brand identity. So, and that's tough to look at that in light of the scriptures, wanting to reform your church in light of the scriptures, and see budget, charisma, and brand as a reason not only churches grow enough to need multi-sites, but then why those multi-sites grow. And then that affects what draws people there is what keeps them there. So that affects the unity of the church. And I don't think churches are supposed to be so dependent for their unity on the life and work of one man who does all the preaching, speaking. That man results in moral failure. It's not like just one church is in jeopardy. If a man results in moral failure, 10 churches are, in the case of Marcel and Mark Driscoll, or Rob Bell when he was doing his churches up in Minnesota before he went all woke and deconstructed. Members, in comparison to a single site model, are demoted. And you don't want to demote members. We are Baptists. And a lot of the non-denominationals that are out there perpetuating a multi-site, they're not just non-denominationals, but evangelical Protestants mostly, are former Baptists or have been involved in evangelicalism long enough to know that congregational autonomy is a valuable thing. So where is the congregational autonomy? And then why, like we said before, why is there almost kind of a trend to choose the screen over a live experience or being a part of what's happening in that building? And so I guess my fear, and again, this is not, you shouldn't join a multi-site. Here's my ultimate thing. If you're not in a church, find a church. Hear the gospel of Jesus Christ being preached. Seek discipleship. You're not guaranteed conversion if you just seek after conversion and stop. If you go towards discipleship in Jesus Christ, conversion can occur and you'll run the race well. Be a disciple somewhere, find a faithful church. But how much of this is built on brand identity?
Yeah.
Brand identity and the kind of CEO style is where I feel like multi-sites can start off by doing a lot of good, but result in a lot of harm.
Yeah. Oh yeah. And I know we got to wrap up here, but I think that's my thought would be if I was talking to somebody who was considering it or was maybe going to one currently. Again, find you a Bible believing, gospel preaching church. But my question would be why does this attract you? Is it just, well, they've got a really good communicator? Okay, well, all right. So you're believing there's nobody else that could preach the word effectively? Or is it, is it the brand that is very hip and trendy? Because these churches tend to kind of have that appeal to them. They're kind of the hip place to go. The other thing would be, is it because it is a very a la carte experience? Meaning you're getting to pick and choose, and there's nobody pushing you to do stuff you're not comfortable with.
And everyone wants to be a part of something growing, and everyone wants to be a part of something new. And
yeah, and
it's
you
not
look
just
around, and it's all people, all people that look like you and of your generation, and you're all can come in, and it's catered to your wants and desires and everything. And then you go back into your life and you live your individual life with nobody saying, "Hey, come be a messy part of the world with me."
Yeah.
So that would be my only hesitation to somebody in that experience would be like, "Hey, maybe check your heart on why you're there. Is it because you enjoy being able to blend in and gray man and just slip through? That's not what we're called to do."
Yeah, and I think I'll end it on this too, because I think this is important for people to hear our heart. I applaud those who are usually involved in these kind of movements because they care enough to evangelize. I'm so sick of people who are part of just smaller churches and think that they're better than everyone because their church is smaller and that means they're more faithful. That's not true. There's at least that's not alone on itself true. Your church may be suffering in your area because you're standing on convictions that aren't popular in your area. That's perfectly common. But no, you're not holier because you're not growing. And this gives you an idea of, that I'm losing out to the multi-site church in the area. I'm going to tell you something. They have people who care, and they have people who actually go out and work and volunteer and serve and spread the word. It's why they're growing so much. Churches aren't growing because the pastor is doing something brand new from the pulpit. It's the same Bible, and typically, after a variety of personalities are involved, the same dynamics. It is because people care enough to get other people excited about their church. Churches are growing because church members care enough. And so I applaud them. I tell my non-denominational friends, people I disagree with across the board on several theological issues, I wish, we had more people who cared like you care. I think our church cares, but evangelism, every church needs a lesson in hardcore evangelism. People who are willing to sit down at main campus and go, this is the only church that matters. Are you getting out there and sharing the love of Christ with people? So I do believe there's a reason for them sometimes when it comes to people who maybe don't want to darken the door of a church, and a multi-site feels a little bit more, separate from something that they'd had a bad experience with. So I just think being stagnant and staying in that site instead of becoming its own church plant, because we are 100% in favor of church plants. We are 100% in favor of the kingdom expanding, faithful churches expanding, more and more people becoming disciples of Jesus Christ. That is the goal. So I applaud that. No one's dismaying that idea. We're saying that we just need to be a bit more aware maybe in the execution. And then I would think we're making a substantial argument for why people should pastor at those campuses. Even if you remain in a sister network, I think that there's a value to training up preachers for the future, because you won't live forever if you're the main guy, and live preaching. Live preaching and preaching to people, I think, just has an inherent value that is hard to shake. And so I would probably, I probably wouldn't attend a multi-site church if I wasn't in ministry. I might attend a church that had multi-sites, but I would want to be at that main campus where the preaching was going on. I think that's kind of where if that was the only church in my area that, it was available.
Yeah. One distinction. We are in favor of the Dollar General method. We are not in favor of that Family Dollar, Dollar Tree combo. That's an abomination. That's
If
heresy,
if
and
you
we should
take
stand against it.
away one thing from this, it's that Dollar General really has done a better job than most churches at getting their brand out there. And that if you prefer Family Dollar or Dollar Tree, may God have mercy on your soul, really.
Yeah.
Just you've missed the boat, you've missed the point, and I just don't think you should.
Yeah. And
You should,
people, you've heard
you
it. You heard it here
shouldn't be
first.
there.
We are planting. What is it? Clover Valley Community Church.
Yeah, that
That's
sounds
coming up
perfect.
next. Clover
Yeah,
Valley.
exciting. Well, thank you so much for being on, brother, and getting us in the hot water. No, I think that's the
Looking for some
goal.
brand sponsorship. Yeah.
And if the point, if you're listening first time, well, number one, we are available wherever podcasts are streaming. So please subscribe, listen to us on Apple or Spotify, wherever you go. We appreciate your Spotify subscriptions. But most importantly, just thank you for wanting to know more about the Word of God. So above all, find a faithful church and be a disciple. And if that's a multi-site for you right now, I'd rather you be there than nowhere. So be with you, or I hope to be with you next week, every Monday from here on out. Every Monday is what we're trying to do. Thank you for listening. Hope you have a wonderful week, and God bless.